When Private Marcus Reed was found wandering alone in the forest, his eyes wide and his hands covered in dirt, the first responders barely managed to get him onto the helicopter. His lips moved soundlessly, as if he was screaming in silence. No bullet, no cut, and yet he was destroyed. He was the only survivor of a mission classified as safe, and since that day, he has never uttered a single word. The mission arrived at the Echo-9 platoon in a sealed envelope bearing the seal of the Special Tactics Operations Division. It was a simple reconnaissance patrol in a remote sector of northern Montana, an area marked as inactive for more than 2 years. With no recent records of hostile activity, the mission seemed like a welcome break from the last few exhausting weeks. None of the 5 men hesitated. Accomplish, report, return. That was the rule. Lieutenant Michael Ellis read the orders aloud. Coded route. Estimated time, 72 hours. The objective was simple. Map the Duskwood Valley and check access points for future operations. The command didn't expect any problems, but something about the way Ellis put the paper away afterwards, folding it with unusual slowness, stuck in Reed's mind, as if he sensed something the others didn't. The base watched them leave at dawn. 5 figures in slow motion, their radios synchronized, and their hearts calm. No one could have imagined that it would be the last time they would see 4 of them. The forest seemed like just another expanse of nothingness, but there was something there, something that didn't want to be found. In addition to Reed and Lieutenant Ellis, the group included tracking specialist Neil Carter, communications operator Frank Mendez, and heavy gunner Travis Boone. An experienced team used to conflict zones, camouflaged mines and enemy ambushes, each with enough scars to recognize danger, or at least they thought they would. Boone, always laughing, joked about taking the last pack of cigarettes so that the rest would beg. Mendez kept his eyes on the portable radar, even though he knew that everything in the area was jamming. Carter, the quietest of the group, was already beginning to observe the ground and the branches, as if looking for invisible footprints. Reed, as second in command, kept his eyes on the horizon, relying more on instinct than on maps. The dynamic between them was solid. Every step in the unknown terrain was backed up by years of coexistence, but it was impossible to predict what would happen when you entered territory that didn't respond to the common laws of nature. As they advanced, the vegetation seemed to close in, denser, more muffled. The forest didn't want them there, but it was too early to understand that. Gradually, the radios began to fail. First squeaks, then sudden cuts. Finally, just silence. Mendez tried repositioning the antenna, checking the cables, resetting the channels. Nothing. It was as if they had entered a bubble where sound didn't cross borders. The remote control didn't respond. The base had disappeared on the other side of the frequency. The GPS also began to fail. It marked unrealistic positions, sometimes indicating that they were in the ocean or in places with negative altitude. Carter had to rely solely on the compass and the sun. But the sun, for some reason, seemed to move more slowly, or maybe faster. Time no longer made sense in there. Boone joked that they were in a dead zone, as if they were off the planet. Nobody laughed. The silence of the forest was the kind that weighs on your shoulders. There were no birds, no insects, no sound of the wind in the leaves, just their footsteps and their breathing. It was as if they were being listened to, but by something that didn't need ears. On the second night, Carter found strange marks on a fallen tree. They didn't look like claws or human tools. They were more like deep notches made in circular patterns. He called Ellis, who analyzed them in silence. No explanation. But that night, no one slept properly. Vague sounds echoed through the trees. Crashes, whispers, as if someone were imitating human voices with a delay of seconds. In the morning, one of the backpacks had been dragged a few meters from the camp. No footprints, just the grooves in the ground, as if it had been pulled by something floating. Boone suggested that it was an animal, perhaps a bear, but Carter just shook his head. His eyes seemed more attentive than usual, as if they were looking for something he didn't want to find. Still, they followed. There was no turning back. Ellis repeated the protocol: mission, report, return. But something in him was beginning to crack. Mendez tried to keep the video records, but the files disappeared or appeared corrupted. Reed wrote in his logbook by hand, something he hadn't done for years. The group was no longer the same, and the forest, The forest was watching them from within. On the third day, Reed had a dream, or he thought it was. He was standing in the middle of the bush, naked, his feet sunk in the mud. All around him, familiar voices were calling him by the wrong names, using the wrong tones, as if they had been copied by something that didn't know it was human. He woke up sweating, with dirt on his fingernails, and the feeling that he had actually left the tent. Boone began to hear laughter during his watch. At first he thought it was Carter playing tricks, but Carter was asleep. Mendez registered an unusual noise on the radio, something that was only audible with headphones. When he zoomed in on his laptop, he realized it was a recording of his own voice, repeating old messages like an echo out of time, a kind of sound mirror. Ellis began to walk ahead of the group, alone. He was writing on a pad that he hid from the others. When Reed tried to look, he smiled, and for a moment, the smile wasn't his, as if something else was using Ellis's body to get close to the others, something that had patience, something that knew how to wait. The following night, Reed woke up to the sound of footsteps around the camp. He thought it was Boone, perhaps on patrol, but when he unzipped his tent, he saw everyone else asleep. The footsteps continued, slow, heavy. Then they stopped, and then came the voices. Voices that seemed to be saying his name, but from behind the trees, as if they had known him for much longer than the army itself. Mendez, hearing something similar in his headset, dropped the equipment. He swore he heard the voice of his daughter, whom he hadn't seen for months, calling him by his childhood nickname. No one scoffed. Boone held the machine gun in his hands even in his sleep, his fingers trembling. Ellis was becoming more and more isolated, answering questions out loud that no one had asked. The next morning, they found marks around the perimeter, concentric circles formed with small stones. Inside each one was an object belonging to the group. Boone's bullet, Mendez's lighter, an old portrait of Ellis. Reed felt panic creep up the base of his neck. Someone, or something, was toying with them, and he was in no hurry. It was on the afternoon of the fourth day that Mendez managed to pick up a strange signal. It was weak, as if it was coming from underground, and alternated between Morse code and fragments of old team conversations. Ellis insisted that it be ignored. Natural interference, he said. But Reed knew the lieutenant was lying. His eyes avoided direct contact, and his hands trembled when he thought no one was looking. Carter, who until then had remained calm, sat down by a tree and began to cry. Something in him had broken. He said he felt as if the forest was trying to remember things using pieces of him. His words were disjointed, but the anguish was clear. They were being copied, replicated, tested, as if the earth itself was studying them. It was Mendez who made the last contact with the base. He climbed a natural ridge and activated the emergency signal. For a few seconds, he heard a call back, but it wasn't the central station. It was his own voice, repeating the message before he had even finished it. He ripped the headset from his ear and shouted. The echo that came back wasn't his. Boone was the first to disappear. It was dawn. No noise, no struggle, no trace. He just disappeared from the tent. Reed searched for him for hours next to Carter, shouting his name among the trees. Ellis remained seated, staring into the fire as if nothing had happened. When asked if he wasn't going to help, he simply replied, "He's already played his part." In the late afternoon, they found Boone's gun embedded in the trunk of a tree, wrapped in vines that hadn't existed the day before. Carter suggested they abandon the mission, but Ellis refused. He said they were closer than ever to the tipping point. His words sounded rehearsed, as if he were reciting something memorized, not thought out. Mendez, overcome with fear, began to leave markings on the trees as a way of finding his way back. But the next day, the marks had disappeared. Or worse, they had moved. Some were on trees that were no longer where they were supposed to be. The forest seemed to be in constant motion, as if it was also trying to get out of itself. On the evening of the fifth day, a sudden storm descended upon them. Lightning lit up faces among the trees, or at least they looked like faces. Reed fired 3 times into the darkness. Carter tried to calm him down, but as he looked at the horizon, he saw it too, a silhouette that imitated Boone's gait, only it missed the beat, like a puppet trying to be a person. The camp was filled with chaos. Ellis disappeared for a few hours and returned with his face covered in mud, with no memory of where he had been. Mendez collapsed and started repeating phrases in Spanish, the same ones his mother used to say when he was a child, as if trying to get back to a safe place in his mind. The next morning, Carter was dead, but there was no blood, no signs of an attack. He just lay there with his eyes open, his mouth dirty with dirt, as if he had swallowed his own fear. Reed tried to revive him, but knew it was no use. Looking up at the sky, he realized that the sun wasn't in the right place. Time had broken inside. Of the Echo-9 platoon, only Reed remained. He walked for hours, maybe days, without direction. The forest no longer seemed real. The branches moved as if they were breathing. He heard his own voice coming from places he had never been. He saw his companions' footprints on trails they hadn't followed, and always the feeling of being followed by something that knew exactly where he would be. When he finally fell to his knees near a clearing, he thought it was the end. The last thing he remembers before the rescue was seeing, on the other side of the vegetation, the perfect image of Lieutenant Ellis. But there was something wrong. His head turned the wrong way, and his eyes didn't blink. The thing was just watching him. Then darkness. The helicopter found him by chance. A satellite maintenance team had picked up anomalous thermal signals in the area. When they located him, Reed was dehydrated, hypothermic, and in a complete catatonic state. He repeated only one sentence: "It's not just forest. It never was." After that, he said nothing more. Never again. When the rescuers lifted him into the helicopter, Reed didn't even react. His body was shivering, even wrapped in thermal blankets. His eyes were open, but he couldn't see. A doctor tried to staunch what he thought were wounds, but there were no cuts. Just circular bruises on the palms of his hands and the soles of his feet, as if he had spent days kneeling and standing on something hard and uneven. During the flight back, Reed mumbled disconnected words, fragments of names, numbers, coordinates. But the only clear phrase everyone heard was spoken in a whisper, just before he lost consciousness. "She's following me." No one understood, but everyone wrote it down. After that, silence, as if Reed's own mind had closed the door forever. The Delta 7 base received him with maximum protocol. Doctors, psychiatrists, intelligence officers. Everyone wanted answers. They wanted to know what had happened to the platoon. But Reed just stared at them. His mouth moved as if he wanted to scream, and he stopped. He always stopped, as if something inside him was still trapped in the forest, watching from the inside out. The medical reports were inconclusive. Physically, Reed was stable. No brain trauma, no drugs detected. But psychologically, the diagnoses ranged from catatonia to severe reactive psychosis. He was kept under observation, then transferred to a military center specializing in veterans with post-traumatic stress. The final report read, "Unable to return to service. Retirement due to permanent mental disability." The Army tried to reconstruct the mission with electronic data, but the records of the operation were corrupted. Mendez's recordings came in empty files. Radio communications appeared, scrambled, and GPS coordinates didn't match any recognizable points. The zone where Reed was found was reclassified as a total no-go area. For the next few months, Reed remained silent. He didn't respond to stimuli. He showed no emotional reaction. He just watched, especially at night, when he would stare at specific points on the ceiling, as if he saw something there, something no one else could see. The doctors started taking turns at night. Some said they heard strange noises coming from his room. One even swore he saw shadows moving behind the mirrored glass. Before they gave up completely, the High Command authorized one last attempt, a psychological interrogation with a hypnotic induction protocol. The session was recorded, and only 2 people took part: Lieutenant Colonel Price, a veteran military psychologist, and Major Linton, a field intelligence supervisor. For 30 minutes, Reed didn't react, until Price asked the simplest question: "Where is Lieutenant Ellis?" It was like pulling a trigger. Reed began to cry, silently, heavy tears, one after the other. Then he shook his head, as if to say no, over and over again. When Price insisted, "Have you seen his body?" Reed whispered, for the first time in months, a single sentence. "He's still there, but it's not him anymore." The atmosphere in the room changed. The air became heavy. Price had a sudden seizure and fell backwards, convulsing. Linton hurriedly switched off the equipment. The recording showed interference, flashes of static, and for a brief moment, a background noise similar to those picked up by Mendez. It was the last attempt. After that, Reed was isolated. No further contact was authorized. Months later, a counterintelligence agent discovered that Lieutenant Ellis, prior to the mission, had requested access to files from the former Operation Empty Sun, a series of classified explorations carried out decades earlier in that same region of Montana. The connection had been ignored in the initial reports, but was now gaining importance. Among the documents, there were references to unnatural phenomena and anomalous behavior in soldiers exposed for more than 48 hours to the forest. One of these missions ended with 3 disappearances and a suicide. The survivors also showed the same pattern: silence, insomnia, and compulsive drawings of circular, repetitive shapes. Reed had drawn the same patterns on his bedroom wall with his fingernail. The revelation was hushed up, and access to the Empty Sun files was again restricted, but someone had left a partial copy on the Delta 7 base's internal servers. Among the highlighted phrases, one was repeated: "The Earth keeps what it sees, and gives it back when it's ready." Nobody knew what that meant, but everything was starting to fall into place, or worse, opening up. During neurological monitoring sessions, Reed began to react to certain sounds. Not human voices, but noises picked up in the depths, rhythmic beats, as if from a distant heart. In one of the tests, his heartbeat synchronized with the external sounds. The doctors stopped the test immediately, but the machine continued to register intense brain activity. And then came the flashes. Images projected onto the screen by state-of-the-art electroencephalograms showed disconnected figures. Trees, twisting, eyes in impossible places, hands sticking out of the ground, and a face, which appeared to be Ellis's, completely deformed, as if it had been pulled from the inside. Scientists said it wasn't possible to obtain such defined images of the human mind. But there they were. Reed began to draw, with pencil, then with blood. Always the same circles, always the same lines. Therapists tried to interpret the symbols as subconscious manifestations, but a linguist recognized patterns similar to prehistoric writing found in sealed caves in Alaska, a language that no one should know, and that Marcus Reed was now somehow writing perfectly. Even without speaking, Reed began to communicate in another way. His drawings were organized in sequence, as if they formed a visual diary. A group of intelligence specialists spent weeks trying to assemble the pages, which were scratched into notebooks, walls, clothes, and sheets. What emerged was not just symbolism, it was a fragmented narrative, a memory trying to escape. The story showed the 5 men entering the forest. In each frame, a silhouette disappeared, swallowed up by circular shapes on the ground. In the penultimate drawing, Reed's face was split in 2, one part with his eyes closed, the other with his eyes open, as if he lived in 2 worlds at once. And in the last one, a perfect circle with a spiral in the center. Below it, a single word written with precision: she. This entity, whatever it was, wasn't visible at first, but the forest was her body, the winds, her eyes, the earth, her mouth, the voices, memories. It was as if the space was possessed by an ancient, dormant consciousness, and the soldiers, just catalysts, markers of presence, like fingers in a wound forgotten by time. Curiously, a reconnaissance expedition sent out after the platoon's disappearance was unable to find the paths used by the original team. The coordinates marked by Reed, which now seemed consistent with his drawings, pointed to a sector that officially didn't exist on military maps, as if the trail had been erased from ordinary reality. Lieutenant Colonel Price, still shaken by the collapse he suffered during the interrogation, obsessed with answers, requested direct access to the area. He was denied, but days later, he disappeared from his quarters. His car was found on the highway near Duskwood Forest. No sign of a break-in, struggle, or escape. Just the passenger seat sunk, as if someone, or something, had been traveling with him. The only clue he left was a piece of paper with scribbles similar to Reed's, and a handwritten phrase: "If she remembers me, I'll remember her." The military base officially ignored the case, but Price's file disappeared from the internal networks, as if it had never existed. 2 months after Price's disappearance, what was left of Ellis's backpack was found at a logistical disposal base. 300 kilometers from the mission site. No explanation as to how it got there. Inside was a handwritten diary, hidden under the inner lining. The pages were partially burnt, but some notes survived. Ellis mentioned repetitive dreams before the mission. "The forest is calling me," she wrote. "It wants me to see." He spoke of a voice coming from the roots, and of a presence he called only she. In the last few days before sending the mission, he started writing in codes that mixed English with geometric symbols. Some passages matched Reed's drawings. The most disturbing was what was written on the back cover. "If one of us comes back, it's no longer one of us." This phrase was taken to the analysis team, but no one could determine whether Ellis was talking about himself or Reed. And it was at that moment that a new protocol was put in place. Marcus Reed should no longer be considered just a survivor, but a possible gateway. When reanalyzing the satellite images of the mission area, something caught the eye. For 3 consecutive days, a section of the terrain showed distortions in the pixels, as if it were being altered in real time. It wasn't a technical fault. The trees seemed to change position. The shadows didn't match the sun angle. And in the center, something round, a geometric light that appeared and disappeared. Geologists were consulted. No natural formation could explain the pattern. It was as if the ground was opening and closing in a cycle of its own, an invisible pattern that repeated itself in 72-hour cycles. The same estimated time as the Platoon's mission, the same time Marcus spent inside the forest. Thermal analysis detected subsoil heat not compatible with geological activity. And strangest of all, a constant low-frequency noise, inaudible to the human ear, but present throughout the perimeter. When converted into sound waves and accelerated, the result was a repetitive sequence, 5 tones, as if they were being called. 5 tones, like 5 soldiers. 4 haven't returned. 1 is still listening. Reed began to walk in circles inside the psychiatric center. Always the same number of steps. Always the same times. A pattern. Doctors started filming him, and after weeks, they discovered that his movements formed symbols. He drew with his feet, and these symbols matched ancient formations in archaeological sites in Siberia, never made public. A visiting linguist noticed that Reed seemed to be following a kind of score, as if he were dancing or responding to a piece of music that no one else was listening to. A sequence, an invocation, and then, without warning, Reed stopped. For 3 days, he didn't move. He didn't even blink. When he did move again, his eyes were different, as if something inside him had finally woken up. That same week, the birds in the area around the base disappeared. Nearby, domestic animals began to run away, agitated. One of the doctors said he dreamt of Marcus standing in the middle of the forest saying, "You're already here. You just haven't realized it yet." He woke up screaming, and with his feet covered in dirt. In the early hours of November 12th, seismic sensors in the Duskwood region registered a series of regular pulsations coming from underground. Not earthquakes, they were beats, like rhythmic hammering, spaced exactly every 90 seconds. The curious thing was that this rhythm was identical to the patterns Reed had been drawing with his feet weeks before. Engineers sent to the site reported strong magnetic interference. One of the drones sent deep into the forest returned with its lens completely opaque, as if it had been exposed to unrecognized radiation fields. But there was no electronic damage. The equipment, despite being blind, continued to record, and registered a strange, deep sound that sounded like breathing, long, ancient. Marcus Reed, hundreds of kilometers away, woke up at 3:14 a.m., exactly the minute of the first recorded pulse. He was standing beside the bed, his eyes fixed on the wall. When a nurse found him, he repeated just one sentence, "She's digging." That was the last thing he said, before losing consciousness completely. After Lieutenant Coley and Price's disappearance, some of the documents he had been investigating were found hidden in his former home. They were drafts, loose notes, and a disturbing hypothesis. According to Price, the forest was not just a corrupted place. It was the shell of something buried, something that had been sealed away by ancient peoples, not by containment, but by symbiosis. He spoke of an entity that learned by imitation, absorbed behaviors, and gave back distorted versions. An organic intelligence, pre-human, perhaps not extraterrestrial, but predating what we understand as time. The forest, in this context, would be a body. The sounds, its thoughts, the circles, its eyes, and the soldiers. The first food in decades. Price concluded, she doesn't want to invade, she wants to be remembered, because memory is existence, and we, in seeing it, have already participated in its form. The final note was almost a plea. Don't bury Marcus Reed. He is the portal. Against all medical advice, Reed disappeared from the psychiatric center. The cameras stopped working for 11 minutes, long enough for him to disappear without a trace. The only image recorded was a low-resolution thermal capture, a naked body walking towards a deserted area. Next to him, another figure, taller, impossible to identify. A search was launched. Elite teams returned to the forest with special authorization from Central Command. For 3 days, nothing, until they found a clearing that hadn't existed before. In the center, footprints, but not Reed's. There were many, human, childish, animalistic. Mixed as if everything was being returned at the same time. The sensors failed again. Time seemed distorted. One soldier even fainted and woke up with the same phrase as Reed tattooed on his skin, without knowing how. She remembers you. Command ordered immediate evacuation. The forest was now not only watching, it responded. Days later, an opening in the ground was found in the exact spot where the Echo-9 platoon was originally sent. It wasn't a cave. It was symmetrical, as if it had been excavated with precision. The walls inside were covered in symbols identical to Reed's. And down there, something pulsed. Slow, steady, like the beating of a mineral heart. The sound could not be heard directly, but it vibrated inside the body. The soldiers who got close began to show signs of disorientation, memory loss, and speech changes. One of them tried to gouge out his own eyes. He said he didn't want to see through it. Another disappeared into the tunnel, even with safety ropes attached to his body. The rope came back on its own. They decided to seal off the site with reinforced concrete and layers of lead. Not to contain it, but to delay it. No one believed it could be contained any longer. The command reclassified the entire region as a risk zone on a par with nuclear incidents. But what was there was never about containment. It was about awakening, and now she was waking up. Marcus Reed was never found. No camera, radar, or special agent had ever located a trace of him. But the forest had visitors again, not human ones. Flocks of crows began circling the perimeter. Deer were seen standing at the edge of the fence, staring in silence. Residents of the surrounding small towns began to report dreams of a faceless man who repeated names and voices that were not their own. The army remains silent. The official version still says, communication failure and operational loss. But behind the scenes, every new soldier who joins field missions receives an unwritten instruction. Never look at the forest for more than 3 seconds. Never follow sounds that seem familiar. And if you hear your own name whispered, run in the opposite direction. Because what lives inside now knows human language. It knows our faces, our rhythms, our fears. It no longer needs bodies, only memories. Because it is in oblivion that it sleeps, and in remembrance, it breathes.